At 8 months pregnant, standing in a ballroom full of people who used to call me family, I realized something. Humiliation isn't the worst thing they can do to you, it's underestimating you. I remember the exact moment the laughter started, soft at first, like the polite kind you hear at a bad joke, then louder, sharper, spreading across the room until it felt like it was pressing against my skin from every direction. Vanessa stood at the center of it all, one hand wrapped elegantly around a champagne flute, the other holding the microphone as if she had been waiting her entire life for that exact moment. The chandelier above her cast a warm golden light, making everything look beautiful, almost surreal, like a scene from a movie where you don't yet realize you're watching the turning point. And of course, she said, her voice smooth and perfectly measured, we have Margaret here tonight, proving that some surprises just refuse to arrive on time. A pause, a tilt of her head, then her eyes dropped, slowly, deliberately, to my stomach. Or maybe, they arrive when no one expects them anymore. The room erupted. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply rested my hand against the curve of my belly, smoothing the fabric of my navy dress the way I had done 100 times before, and smiled. Not the kind of smile that asks for understanding. Not the kind that tries to defend itself. Just a small, controlled expression, one that gave nothing away. From where I stood near the back of the ballroom, I could see everything clearly. The long tables dressed in ivory linens. The polished silverware catching the light. The servers moving quietly along the edges of the room as if they had been trained not to notice moments like this. And at the head table, my son Ethan, sitting beside his wife, not laughing, but not stopping it either. That, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. He kept his gaze fixed on his plate, his jaw tight, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if shrinking himself might make the moment pass faster. He didn't look at me. Not once. Vanessa continued speaking, her voice light, almost playful, but every word sharpened with intent. I mean, let's be honest, she added, glancing around the room, inviting others into the performance. When someone your age announces something like this, you can't help but wonder, is it a miracle or just a misunderstanding? More laughter, louder this time. Someone near the front even clapped. I adjusted the sleeve of my dress. I shifted my weight slightly from one foot to the other. I let them have their moment, because they thought that was what this was, a moment, a joke, a harmless piece of entertainment at a banquet meant to celebrate family success, whatever that meant now. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't understand what I had already begun to understand days before this night ever arrived. Vanessa lowered the microphone, satisfied, her lips curving into a smile that looked effortless but had taken years of practice. She turned her head just enough to glance at Ethan, expecting approval, expecting alignment. He gave her a small nod. That was enough for her. It always was. I watched them for a second longer, committing the image to memory, not because it hurt, but because clarity matters. Moments like these are rarely as loud as people think. The real shift happens quietly, inside you, when something settles into place and refuses to move again. I picked up my clutch from the table beside me. No rush. No sudden movements. Just a simple, deliberate action. A few heads turned, noticing that I wasn't reacting the way they expected. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor, each step steady, measured, unhurried. No one stopped me. No one called my name. The laughter faded behind me as the doors closed, replaced by the low hum of the hotel hallway, neutral and empty and clean in a way the ballroom had not been. I paused for a moment, my hand resting against the cool metal of the door handle. For a brief second, I allowed myself to feel it. Not the embarrassment, not the anger, but the shift. The moment when everything changes shape and reveals what it truly is. Then I let it go. By the time I reached the parking lot, the night air was cool against my skin, grounding in a way nothing inside that building had been. I took a slow breath, then another, my hand still resting lightly on my stomach. They thought they understood what they were laughing at. They thought this visible, undeniable thing, was the center of the story. But it wasn't. Not even close. Because what I was carrying, what they had just mocked so casually, so confidently, wasn't what they believed it to be. And by the time they realized that, it would already be too late. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed it gently behind me. No slamming. No shaking hands. Just calm. Controlled. Certain. I started the engine, the soft vibration filling the silence, and allowed myself one final thought before pulling away. Let them laugh. Let them celebrate what they think they've won. Because tonight wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. And they had just made their first mistake. I did not go home right away that night. Instead, I drove without a destination, letting the quiet hum of the engine and the empty streets carry me somewhere far from the echo of that ballroom. The city looked different after midnight. Storefronts dark. Traffic lights blinking in slow, patient rhythms. The kind of silence that does not ask questions. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting lightly against my stomach, feeling the steady rise and fall of my own breathing, grounding myself in something real, something that belonged only to me. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, the sky had begun to soften at the edges, the first hint of morning stretching across the horizon. My house stood exactly as I had left it. Quiet, orderly, untouched. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, closing it gently behind me, as if the noise of the outside world might follow me in if I was not careful. The air inside still carried the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser I had left on earlier that afternoon. Everything was where it should be. The framed photographs on the wall, the neatly arranged books on the shelves, the small ceramic bowl by the entryway where I had placed my keys for years. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. I slipped off my heels and set them neatly by the door, then walked slowly into the kitchen. The digital clock on the stove read 5:12 a.m. I filled a glass with water, took a small sip, and leaned against the counter, allowing the stillness to settle around me. No voices. No laughter. No carefully disguised cruelty. Just silence. I had always believed silence could be comforting. That night, it felt like clarity. I did not cry. Not then. Not later. There was nothing left in me that needed to break. Instead, I moved through the house with quiet intention, turning on a single lamp in the living room, then lowering myself carefully onto the couch. My body was tired, but my mind was not. It was moving, slowly and deliberately, sorting through everything that had led to that moment. Because that moment had not been random. It had not been an accident or a misunderstanding or a joke that went too far. It had been planned. And once you understand that something is planned, you begin to see all the pieces that came before it. I reached for my phone and placed it on the coffee table in front of me, staring at the dark screen for a moment before unlocking it. There were messages, missed calls, notifications that had begun to pile up sometime after I left the banquet. I did not open them. Not yet. Instead, I opened my email. There it was. Exactly where I had left it 2 days earlier. The subject line was simple. No urgency. No dramatic language. Just a name I recognized immediately. Daniel Reeves. I tapped the message open and read it again, slowly, carefully, as if the words might shift if I moved too quickly. They did not. They remained exactly as they had been when I first saw them. Formal. Precise. Unemotional. The way legal language always is. It had arrived 72 hours before the banquet. 72 hours before Vanessa stood in front of a room full of people and turned my life into a performance. At the time, I had read it once. Then twice. Then I had closed my phone and sat in silence, letting the information settle in the only way information like that can. It had not surprised me. Not completely. But it had confirmed something I had been slowly, quietly suspecting for a long time. I set the phone down again and leaned back against the couch, my gaze drifting to the window as the light outside grew stronger. Vanessa had always been careful. That was the first thing I noticed about her when Ethan introduced us. Not warm. Not welcoming. Careful. Every word measured. Every gesture intentional. She knew exactly how she wanted to be seen, and she built herself around that image with precision. At first, I thought it was confidence. Then I thought it was ambition. It took longer to understand what it really was. Control. She did not enter a room. She adjusted it. Slowly. Quietly. Until everything aligned with her. And Ethan. My son. He had not always been that way. There was a time when he laughed easily. When he spoke without hesitation. When he would look at me, and I could see exactly what he was thinking without needing to ask. That time feels distant now. Not gone. But buried under layers of something else. Something quieter. Something more cautious. I do not know exactly when it changed. Changes like that rarely announce themselves. They happen in small moments. Missed phone calls. Shorter conversations. decisions made without asking. And eventually, one day, you realize you are no longer part of the equation. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to remember clearly. The way Vanessa had looked at me that night. Not just confident, certain, as if she believed there would be no consequences. As if the story had already been written and all she had to do was perform her part. That was the mistake. Not the words. Not the laughter. The certainty. I opened my eyes and reached for my phone again, this time scrolling past the messages and selecting a different contact. I did not hesitate. I pressed call and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ring on the other end. 1, 2, 3. Then a voice, calm and familiar. Good morning, Margaret. I exhaled slowly. Good morning, Daniel. I said, my voice steady, even. I think it is time we move forward. There was a brief pause on the line. Not surprise. Not confusion. Just acknowledgement. I was expecting your call, he replied. I glanced out the window again, watching as the sunlight finally broke fully across the street, illuminating everything in its path, without hesitation. They made it very easy, I said quietly. And for the first time since the banquet, I allowed myself a small smile. Not for what had happened, but for what was about to. Daniel did not ask unnecessary questions. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. He understood that when someone like me said it was time, it meant the decision had already been made long before the words were spoken. We will proceed exactly as discussed, he said, his tone calm, measured, almost routine, as if what we were about to do was simply another item on a schedule rather than the quiet unraveling of something that had taken years to build. I will have everything prepared by the end of the day. I nodded, even though he could not see me. Good, I replied. And Daniel, make sure there are no delays. There was a brief pause, followed by a soft, almost knowing response. There will not be. I ended the call and set the phone down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the coffee table, as I always did. Small habits matter. They keep things steady when everything else begins to shift. I remained seated for a moment, listening to the silence again, but this time it felt different. Not empty, not heavy, just quiet, purposeful. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, my hand brushing lightly along the wall as I passed the framed photographs. There was one of Ethan at 8 years old, holding a small wooden airplane he had insisted on building himself, his smile wide and unguarded. I paused in front of it, studying the boy I remembered so clearly. He had been proud that day, not because the airplane was perfect, but because he had made it with his own hands. I wondered, briefly, when that sense of ownership had changed, when he had started letting someone else shape the things that mattered to him. I did not stay there long. The past has its place, but it does not change what needs to be done. I continued down the hallway and entered my bedroom, closing the doors softly behind me. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long, quiet shadows across the floor. I moved to the dresser and opened the top drawer, reaching for a small folder I had placed there 2 days ago. It was exactly where I left it. Inside were copies, not originals. I had learned that lesson a long time ago. Originals stay where they belong. Copies are what you carry. I flipped through the pages slowly, not because I needed to read them again, but because repetition sharpens clarity. Financial statements, property records, signatures that looked familiar at first glance, but revealed subtle inconsistencies when examined closely. Dates that did not align. Transfers that had been executed quietly, almost invisibly, over time. Vanessa had been careful. Very careful. But careful does not mean flawless. It means patient. And patience leaves a trail. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer, then walked to the closet and selected a simple outfit for the day. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would draw attention. Just clean lines. Neutral colors. Control is not loud. It does not need to be. By the time I stepped back into the kitchen, the house was fully awake with morning light. I prepared a small breakfast, moving through each step with deliberate precision. A cup of coffee, a slice of toast, nothing more. I sat at the table and ate slowly, not because I was hungry, but because routine matters. It anchors you. Across from me, the empty chair remained exactly where it had always been. For a moment, I allowed myself to notice it. Not with sadness, just acknowledgement. Then I stood, rinsed my plate, and set it neatly in the drying rack. My phone vibrated softly on the counter. I glanced at the screen. Ethan. Of course. The call continued for a few seconds before it went silent, followed almost immediately by a message. I did not open it. Not yet. Timing matters. Instead, I wiped my hands with a towel and walked back into the living room, picking up my bag from the side table. Another vibration. This time, a different name. Claire. I paused for a brief moment, then answered. Good morning, I said. Her voice came through quickly, slightly breathless, as if she had been holding something in for too long. Margaret, I am so sorry about last night. I did not know she was going to do that. I leaned against the arm of the couch, my gaze steady, my voice calm. You do not need to apologize for something you did not create. There was a small pause on the line. It was not right, she continued, quieter now. The way everyone just went along with it. I nodded slightly. People often do, I said. It is easier. Another pause. Then, more carefully, are you okay? I allowed a small silence to settle before answering. I am exactly where I need to be. She did not respond immediately, but I could hear the shift in her breathing, the way understanding begins to take shape even before it is fully formed. Is there anything I can do? She asked. I considered the question for a moment, not because I needed help, but because every piece has its place. Not right now, I replied. But when the time comes, I may ask you to simply tell the truth. Her answer was immediate. I will. I ended the call and slipped my phone into my bag, then moved toward the front door. Before stepping outside, I paused once more, my hand resting lightly against my stomach. They had laughed at what they thought they saw. They had built their confidence on an assumption that I was fragile, that I was unaware, that I was alone. Assumptions can be useful. They make people predictable, and predictable people are easy to prepare for. I opened the door and stepped into the morning light, closing it quietly behind me. The air was crisp, the kind that sharpens your thoughts and clears away anything unnecessary. I walked to my car, each step steady, each movement intentional. There was no urgency, no hesitation, just direction. Because by the time they began to realize what was happening, everything would already be in motion. And this time, I would not be the one standing quietly at the edge of the room, watching. This time, they would be the ones trying to understand how they had missed it. I did not drive to the office immediately. Instead, I took the longer route, letting the road stretch out in front of me while my mind moved backward, carefully retracing the steps that had led us here. Because understanding is not built in a single moment. It is built in patterns. And once you recognize the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The first time Vanessa corrected Ethan in front of me, it was subtle. We were sitting at my dining table, the same one I had used for years, polished and familiar, carrying the quiet history of family dinners and conversations that once felt easy. Ethan had mentioned an investment idea, something he seemed genuinely excited about, his voice carrying that same spark I remembered from when he was younger. Vanessa smiled, placed her hand lightly on his arm, and said, "That is not quite how it works, Ethan. Let me explain it properly." Her tone was gentle, almost helpful, but there was something beneath it, a quiet repositioning. He did not argue. He did not even finish his thought. He simply nodded and leaned back, letting her take over the conversation as if it had never been his to begin with. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Couples do that. They balance each other. They correct each other. But that was how it started. Small adjustments. Barely noticeable. Over time, those adjustments became something else. Decisions that used to include me became updates delivered after the fact. Invitations turned into notifications. Conversations shortened. Silences lengthened. And always, Vanessa remained consistent. Calm. Polite. Controlled. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Control does not require volume. It requires certainty. I remember one afternoon, about a year ago, when Ethan stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, as if deciding whether to step fully inside or remain where he was. "We are thinking of restructuring some things," he said eventually, his words careful, his posture slightly tense. "It is just more efficient this way." I asked him what that meant. He hesitated, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing how much to say. "Vanessa has been working with someone," he continued. "A financial advisor. Just to streamline things." Streamline. It is a harmless word. Clean. Organized. Sensible. But it also removes what does not fit. I nodded, as if I understood, even though I knew I was only being shown part of the picture. "That sounds thorough," I said. He gave a small smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes. It is, he replied. He did not stay long that day. He rarely did anymore. The visits became shorter. The conversations more structured, as if everything had been filtered through an invisible process before reaching me. And Vanessa, she always knew exactly when to appear. A call at the right moment. A message that redirected the conversation. A presence that shifted the dynamic without ever needing to announce itself. She did not push. She guided. Slowly. Consistently. Until what used to feel natural began to feel managed. I began to notice the details. The way documents were presented already signed except for one line. The way explanations were offered before I even asked questions, as if anticipating resistance that never came. The way Ethan would glance at her, just briefly, before answering something that should have been his decision alone. These were not accidents. They were repetitions. And repetition creates structure. The email from Daniel had not introduced something new. It had confirmed something already in motion. Transfers that had been made under the guise of efficiency. Adjustments that shifted control in ways that were difficult to detect unless you knew where to look. Signatures that appeared consistent, but carried slight variations in pressure and spacing. Enough to raise questions. Not enough to trigger immediate alarm. It was precise work. Patient work. The kind that relies on time more than force. And time had been on their side. Until it was not. I turned onto the street where Daniel's office was located. The building standing tall and unremarkable among others just like it. Neutral glass. Clean lines. No unnecessary attention. I parked the car and sat for a moment before stepping out, allowing the final pieces of memory to settle into place. Because memory, when used correctly, is not a burden. It is a map. And I had followed it carefully. From the first correction at the dinner table, to the quiet restructuring, to the documents that did not quite align, to the laughter in that ballroom. Each piece connected, each moment leading to the next. There had been no sudden betrayal, no dramatic shift, just a steady progression. That is what made it effective, and that is what made it vulnerable. Because anything built slowly can be undone the same way. I stepped out of the car and closed the door gently, the sound echoing briefly before disappearing into the morning air. The building entrance was just a few steps away. As I walked toward it, I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, my movement steady, controlled, unhurried. Inside, the lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to places where decisions are made behind closed doors. I crossed the floor without hesitation and pressed the elevator button, watching as the numbers above the door began to shift. Floor by floor, step by step. There is a moment, just before everything changes, when the path becomes clear. Not because it was always obvious, but because you finally see it for what it is. The elevator doors opened. With a soft chime, I stepped inside and turned to face the mirrored wall, catching a brief reflection of myself. Composed. Unshaken. Exactly as I needed to be. I pressed the button for Daniel's floor and waited as the doors closed, sealing the space around me. Because the next time I saw Ethan and Vanessa, it would not be in a ballroom. It would not be in a place where laughter could hide intention. It would be somewhere quieter, more precise, and far less forgiving. The elevator ride was quiet, but not empty. Every second carried intention, each floor marking a transition from observation to action. When the doors opened, Daniel was already waiting just beyond the glass doors of his office suite, exactly where I expected him to be. He had always understood timing. He did not rush forward. He did not offer unnecessary greetings. He simply gave a small nod and held the door open for me, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than courtesy. "Everything is ready," he said as I stepped inside. His office was as precise as his manner. Clean surfaces, minimal decoration, a space designed for clarity rather than comfort. I set my bag down on the table and took a seat across from him, placing my hands lightly in my lap. "Walk me through it again," I said, not because I needed to hear it, but because repetition removes doubt. Daniel opened a folder and turned it toward me, his movements deliberate, measured. "Over the past 18 months, he began, there have been a series of financial adjustments made under your joint family accounts. At first glance, they appear routine. Gradual reallocations, asset consolidations, all within acceptable limits." He paused briefly, allowing the structure of the explanation to settle. "However," he continued, "when viewed collectively, they form a pattern. Control has been shifting. Quietly, consistently, away from you." I nodded once. No surprise, just confirmation. And the signatures? I asked. He slid a document closer. That is where it becomes less subtle. The signatures are consistent enough to avoid immediate scrutiny, but there are discrepancies, pressure variations, timing inconsistencies, enough to raise legitimate questions of authorization. I studied the page without touching it. The lines, the spacing, the familiar shape of my own name, replicated just slightly out of rhythm. It was careful work, but not perfect. And legally? I asked. Daniel leaned back, slightly, folding his hands together. Legally, this gives us leverage. Significant leverage. We can challenge the validity of those transactions, freeze further movement, and if necessary, pursue full reversal. I let the words settle in the room, not as possibilities, but as outcomes already set in motion. Not if necessary, I said quietly. We will. Daniel inclined his head. Understood. He reached for another document, placing it in front of me. This is the next step. A formal notice. It initiates the process and ensures that no additional changes can be made without your direct authorization. I picked up the pen beside the folder, holding it for a moment before placing it back down. Not yet, I said. Daniel did not react immediately. That was another reason I trusted him. He waited. They do not know that I know, I continued. And right now, that is the only advantage that matters. A small pause, then a slight shift in his posture, not disagreement, but recalibration. You are suggesting we delay the filing, he said. Not delay, I corrected. Position. He considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. Then timing becomes critical. It always is, I replied. I reached into my bag and took out my phone, placing it on the table. The screen lit up with missed calls and messages, most of them from Ethan. I tapped one open, scanning it briefly without expression. Mom, we need to talk. Simple. Direct. Late. I set the phone back down. They are already adjusting, I said. They can feel something has shifted. They just do not know what. Daniel followed my gaze to the phone. And when they do, he asked. I allowed a small silence before answering. By then, it will not matter. He closed the folder and rested his hands on the table. There is one more thing, he said. There are indications that Vanessa has been preparing for a more formal transfer. Something larger. Likely within the next week. I looked up at him, my expression unchanged. That aligns with the banquet, I said. Public confidence. Private execution. Daniel nodded. Exactly. I leaned back slightly in my chair, considering the timeline. The sequence was clear now. The performance. The distraction. The assumption that humiliation would weaken me, make me retreat, make me easier to move around without resistance. It was a strategy, not a mistake. Which minute could be anticipated. Then we let her proceed, I said. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in focus. You want her to complete the transfer? I want her to commit to it, I replied. Fully. Publicly. Without hesitation. A brief silence filled the room, the kind that comes when a plan shifts from defensive to strategic. That increases the risk, he said carefully. It increases the exposure, I corrected. And exposure is what we need. He studied me for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod. Understood. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket, my movements calm, unhurried. Prepare everything, I said. But do not file anything until I tell you. Daniel rose as well. You will have full control, he replied. I picked up my bag and my phone, glancing at the screen one last time before slipping it inside. The messages were still there, waiting, as they had been, as they would continue to be. 1 week, I said as I moved toward the door. Daniel did not ask for clarification. He did not need to. He simply nodded. 1 week, he repeated. I stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind me, sealing the conversation in place. The elevator was already waiting. When the doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor, watching as the numbers began to descend. Floor by floor, step by step. 1 week. That was all it would take. Not to react, not to recover, but to let them move exactly where they believe they were safest. Because people reveal the most when they think they have already won. And Vanessa believed she had already won. That was her final mistake. The next 7 days did not feel long. They felt precise, measured. Every hour had its place, every silence its purpose. I did not call Ethan back. I did not respond to his messages. I let them sit exactly where they were, unanswered, unresolved, quietly building tension on the other side of the line. Because when people are used to access, silence unsettles them more than any argument ever could. The first day passed without interruption. The second brought another call. Then another. His messages shifted in tone, slowly at first. From, "We need to talk," to "Mom, please call me when you can," to "I do not understand what is going on." I read each one carefully, without reacting. Understanding is not something you offer. It is something people arrive at on their own. By the third day, Vanessa appeared. Not in person, not yet, but in the space she knew how to occupy best. Indirectly. A message from a shared contact. A casual mention that she had been worried about me after the banquet. Concern, when delivered too late, is rarely genuine. It is positioning. I continued my routine exactly as before. Morning coffee. A walk through the neighborhood, the same route I had taken for years. Each step steady, each breath controlled. I noticed the details more clearly now. The way the light fell across the sidewalks. The quiet hum of distant traffic. The sound of a screen door closing somewhere down the street. Small things. Grounding things. Because while they were reacting, I was stabilizing. And stability is what allows you to move with precision. On the fourth day, Daniel sent a brief message. No details. Just confirmation. They have initiated preliminary steps. I did not need more than that. It meant Vanessa was proceeding exactly as expected. Confident. Unquestioning. Certain that whatever she had started would complete without resistance. That was the nature of certainty. It removes hesitation. And hesitation is often the only thing that prevents exposure. I sat at the kitchen table that morning, my phone resting beside my plate, and allowed myself a moment to consider the timing. Not the outcome. That was already clear. But the sequence. When to step in. When to remain still. When to let the process reach its natural point of no return. Because intervention too early would weaken the structure. Too late would complicate it. There is a narrow space where everything aligns. And that is where control lives. The fifth day brought a knock at my door. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just firm enough to announce intention. I did not rush to answer. I finished what I was doing, rinsed my cup, dried my hands, and walked toward the door at my own pace. When I opened it, Ethan stood there. He looked different. Not dramatically, but enough. His posture was tighter. His expression more uncertain than I had seen in years. "Mom," he said, his voice careful, as if testing the space between us. I stepped aside slightly, allowing the door to open wider. "Come in," I replied. No warmth. No coldness. Just acknowledgement. He entered slowly, his eyes moving through the house as if checking for something he could not quite name. "I have been trying to reach you," he said. I nodded once. "I know." A brief silence settled between us, the kind that used to feel uncomfortable, but now felt necessary. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the living room before speaking again. "About the other night," he began. I raised my hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to redirect. "Sit," I said. He obeyed. That, more than anything, confirmed how much had changed. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, his hands resting on his knees, his posture caught somewhere between confidence and hesitation. I remained standing for a moment longer, then took a seat across from him. "You do not need to explain the other night," I said calmly. I understood it very clearly. He looked up at me, searching for something in my expression. "It was not supposed to go like that," he said. I held his gaze, steady, unblinking. But it did. Another silence. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly. "Vanessa was just trying to lighten the mood," he added. I did not respond immediately. I allowed the words to sit between us, unchanged, unchallenged. Then I spoke. "Is that what you believe?" He hesitated. Just for a moment. But long enough. "I think things got out of hand," he said finally. I nodded once. "They often do." He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. "Look, Mom, there are some things we need to go over. Financial things. Just adjustments. It is nothing serious." There it was. Exactly where it was supposed to be. I folded my hands in my lap, my posture relaxed, my tone even. "Adjustments," I repeated. "Yes," he said quickly, relieved to find agreement where he expected resistance. "Just to make everything more efficient." Efficient. The same word. The same structure. The same script. I watched him for a moment longer, not with judgment, but with clarity. "Of course," I said quietly. "Efficiency is important." His expression eased slightly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough to reveal the confidence returning beneath it. Exactly, he said. I knew you would understand. I allowed a small pause, just long enough to let the moment settle. Then I nodded. When? Do you need me to come in? I asked. He blinked, just once, as if surprised by the question. Soon, he replied. Within the next couple of days. Vanessa has everything arranged. Of course she did. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket, my movements calm and deliberate. Then I will be there, I said. He rose as well, relief now clearly visible in the way he carried himself. Thank you, he said. This will make things much easier. I walked him to the door, opening it without hesitation. As he stepped outside, he turned back slightly, as if considering saying something more. Then he stopped. I am glad you are okay, he said instead. I held the door steady, meeting his eyes one last time. I am exactly where I need to be, I replied. He nodded, uncertain, then walked away, his steps quickening as he reached his car. I closed the door gently and remained there for a moment, my hand resting against the wood. The house was quiet again. Still, unchanged. But now, everything was aligned. They had made their move. Fully, confidently, without hesitation, exactly as planned. And now, so would I. The meeting was scheduled for the 7th day, exactly as Ethan had suggested, but I knew it had been arranged long before he came to my door. Vanessa did not improvise. She constructed. Every detail placed carefully, every step designed to lead to a single outcome. When I arrived at the office building that afternoon, I noticed immediately that everything felt prepared. Not rushed. Not uncertain. Prepared. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, one that carried just enough recognition to suggest my name had been mentioned in advance. They are expecting you, she said, her voice even, professional. Of course they were. I thanked her and walked toward the conference room at the end of the hallway, my steps steady, my posture relaxed. The door was already slightly open. Inside, Ethan sat at the far side of the table, his posture upright but tense, his hands folded in front of him as if he had rehearsed where to place them. Vanessa sat beside him, composed as always, a folder neatly arranged in front of her, a pen placed precisely along its edge. She looked up as I entered, her expression shifting smoothly into something warm, almost welcoming, as if the previous week had never happened. Margaret, she said, rising just enough to acknowledge my presence. I am so glad you could make it. I met her gaze for a brief moment, then took my seat across from them. You said this would be quick, I replied. She smiled slightly, the kind of smile that suggests control rather than kindness. It will be, she said. Ethan leaned forward, his voice softer now, more measured. Mom, we just want to go over a few documents. Nothing complicated. I nodded once, my attention shifting to the folder in front of Vanessa. Of course, I said. She opened it carefully, turning the pages toward me with deliberate precision. We have been reviewing the structure of the family assets, she began, her tone calm, professional, almost rehearsed. And we believe this adjustment will simplify everything moving forward. Simplify. Another clean word. Another carefully chosen layer. I glanced down at the documents, scanning them slowly without reaching for the pen she had placed within easy reach. The language was familiar. Too familiar. Clean paragraphs. Legal phrasing designed to appear transparent while concealing its true direction beneath layers of technical clarity. This consolidates management under a single entity, she continued, her finger tracing a line across the page as if guiding me through something I had not already seen. It removes unnecessary complications and ensures efficiency. Efficiency again. Consistency matters when someone is building a narrative. Ethan watched me closely, his expression somewhere between expectation and relief, as if he believed this moment would resolve everything that had been left unspoken. It is just a formality, he added. Nothing changes for you. I allowed a small pause, letting the silence settle just long enough to stretch the space between us. Then I looked up. Nothing changes, I repeated quietly. Vanessa held my gaze without hesitation. Exactly, she said. I nodded slowly, then reached for the document, lifting it just enough to examine the signature line. The space was blank. Waiting. Prepared. I set it back down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table. You have done a thorough job, I said. Vanessa's smile widened slightly, just enough to reveal satisfaction beneath the surface. We wanted to make sure everything was handled properly, she replied. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. And this needs to be signed. Today? I asked. Ethan nodded quickly. Yes. It is time sensitive. Of course it was. Urgency is often the final layer. The one that pushes decisions forward before questions can catch up. I let a small silence settle again, my gaze moving briefly between the two of them. Vanessa remained composed. Ethan remained hopeful. The structure was complete. The expectation was clear. This was the moment they had been building toward. I reached for the pen, lifting it between my fingers, holding it just above the page. Not touching, not committing, just hovering in that precise space where intention becomes action. Then I stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the rhythm of the room. Vanessa's eyes flickered, just once. A small adjustment. A recalculation. Is something wrong? She asked, her tone still controlled, but now carrying the faintest edge of awareness. I lowered the pen slightly, not placing it down, not moving it forward, just holding it. I was thinking, I said calmly, my voice even, unhurried, about timing. Ethan leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? I looked at him, then back at the document. I mean that decisions like this deserve a moment of reflection, I replied. Vanessa's posture remained steady, but I could see the shift now. Subtle, controlled, but present. Of course, she said quickly. But as Ethan mentioned, there are deadlines involved. Deadlines, pressure, alignment, all carefully placed. I nodded once. Then perhaps we should ensure everything is fully aligned before proceeding. A brief silence filled the room, heavier now, more deliberate. Ethan glanced at Vanessa, just for a second. That glance told me everything. She had not expected resistance. Not here. Not now. Vanessa turned back to me, her smile returning, slightly tighter this time. Margaret, we have already reviewed everything in detail, she said. There is nothing left to clarify. I met her gaze, steady, calm, unshaken. There is always something left, I replied softly. And for the first time since I entered the room, the balance shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not paying attention, but enough. Enough to change what came next. Because they believed this was the moment I would agree. They believed the structure was complete. They believed the outcome was certain. And that belief was exactly what I had been waiting for. I did not move the pen any closer to the paper. Instead, I placed it down carefully, aligning it parallel to the edge of the document. A small gesture that carried more weight than any immediate refusal. Vanessa noticed. Of course she did. Her eyes followed the movement with quiet precision, her smile holding, but thinner now, stretched across a moment that was no longer fully under her control. Margaret, she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying a sharper edge beneath the surface. If there is a concern, we can address it quickly. There is no need to delay. I folded my hands in my lap, my posture relaxed, my tone unchanged. There is no delay, I replied. Only sequence. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, his gaze moving between us, trying to find a stable point in a conversation that was no longer following the script he had expected. Mom, he said, softer now, almost cautious. What do you mean? I let a small silence settle before answering, just long enough to draw their attention fully back to me. I mean that before I sign anything, I said. I would like to make sure we are all working with the same information. Vanessa's expression did not change immediately, but there was a subtle tightening at the corners of her eyes, a brief recalculation happening behind the calm surface she worked so hard to maintain. We are, she said smoothly. Everything has been reviewed thoroughly. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. Then this will be simple, I replied. I reached into my bag and removed my phone, placing it gently on the table beside the document. Not a dramatic motion, just enough to introduce something new into the space. Ethan's eyes dropped to the phone for a moment, then back to me. Vanessa remained still, her attention fixed, her posture unchanged. What is that? She asked. I glanced at the screen, then back at her. Clarity, I said. I tapped the screen once, not opening anything yet, just letting the action register. You mentioned efficiency. I continued, my voice even controlled. And I agree. Efficiency depends on accuracy, on alignment, on making sure nothing is misunderstood. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands tightening together. Mom, I do not think anything is being misunderstood, he said. I met his gaze briefly, then shifted my attention back to Vanessa. Then you will not mind if we confirm. That, I replied. Another small pause. Vanessa's smile returned, carefully measured. Of course not, she said. There is nothing to confirm. I nodded again, then slid the phone a few inches closer to the center of the table, not toward them, not away from me, just enough to reposition the balance of the space. Good, I said softly, because I would prefer that everything we discussed today is complete. The word hung in the air for a moment, carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. Ethan exhaled slowly, his confidence beginning to shift into something less certain. What exactly are we confirming? He asked. I leaned back slightly, my hand still resting calmly in my lap. The structure, I replied. The transfers. The signatures. Vanessa's fingers moved just slightly against the edge of her folder, a controlled adjustment, but an adjustment nonetheless. All of that has already been reviewed, she said. By professionals. I held her gaze, steady and unblinking. I am aware, I said. That is why I asked for my own. The room shifted again. Not loudly. Not visibly to anyone who was not paying attention. But enough. Enough to introduce doubt into a space that had been built on certainty. Ethan blinked, his expression tightening. Your own, he repeated. I nodded once. Yes. Vanessa's posture remained composed, but her voice carried a slightly sharper tone now, carefully contained. Margaret, there was no need to involve anyone else. This is a family matter. I allowed a small pause before responding, just long enough to let the word family settle between us. Exactly, I said quietly, which is why it deserves to be handled correctly. Ethan shifted again, his gaze dropping briefly to the document, then back to me. Mom, are you saying you do not trust us? He asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity. I am saying, I replied slowly, that trust and verification are not the same thing. Vanessa's smile faded, just slightly, enough to reveal the structure beneath it. This is unnecessary, she said. It complicates a process that was designed to be simple. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing. Simplicity is often where details are hidden, I said. The silence that followed was different now. Heavier. More deliberate. Ethan's hands were no longer steady. Vanessa's control, while still present, was no longer absolute. The balance had shifted. Not completely, but enough to change the direction of what came next. I reached for the phone again, my fingers resting lightly against its surface. I thought it would be best, I continued, to ensure that everything is aligned before moving forward. That way, there are no surprises later. Vanessa's eyes narrowed just slightly, the smallest indication of tension beneath her composure. There will not be any surprises, she said. I met her gaze, my expression unchanged. There already were, I replied softly. Another silence. Longer this time. Ethan looked between us, his uncertainty now fully visible, his confidence no longer supported by the structure he had believed in just moments ago. What is going on? He asked. I did not answer him directly. Not yet. Instead, I picked up the pen again, holding it between my fingers, just as I had before. But this time, I did not move it toward the document. I simply held it there, suspended between action and restraint. We are making sure, I said calmly, that what happens next is done properly. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her eyes fixed on mine, her voice quieter now, more controlled than before. And what exactly do you think is not being done properly? She asked. I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, not out of satisfaction, but out of certainty. That, I said, is what we are about to find out. And in that moment, the room no longer belonged to them. It no longer followed their structure, their timing, their certainty. It shifted, quietly, completely, into something else. No one spoke for a moment. The silence stretched just long enough to expose what words usually hide. Ethan looked at me, then at Vanessa, his expression caught between confusion and something else he was not ready to name. Vanessa, on the other hand, did not look away. She held her position, her posture still composed, but the certainty that had defined her just minutes ago was no longer untouched. It had been interrupted. Not broken. Not yet. But interrupted. Margaret, she said finally, her voice lower now, more controlled. as if carefully adjusting her tone to match a situation she had not fully anticipated. If there is something you would like to share, I suggest you do it directly. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the shift. Directness is exactly what I prefer, I replied. My fingers rested lightly on the phone as I tapped the screen, opening the email I had read more times than necessary, not because I needed to, but because repetition removes hesitation. I did not turn the screen toward them immediately. Timing matters. Instead, I let the light from the display reflect faintly against the surface of the table, a quiet signal that something had changed. Ethan leaned forward, his voice tighter now. "Mom, what is this?" he asked. I looked at him briefly, then back at Vanessa. "You mentioned professionals," I said calmly. "So did I." Vanessa's eyes moved, just slightly, toward the phone, then back to me. "And what exactly are you implying?" she asked. I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create drama, but to let the weight of the moment settle into its proper place. "I am not implying anything," I said. "I am confirming." With that, I turned the phone toward them, sliding it across the table until it rested between us. The screen displayed the email. Clean, structured, unemotional, just as it had been when I first received it. Daniel's name at the top. The summary beneath. The pattern clearly outlined. Ethan's eyes dropped to the screen first. He read quickly at the beginning, then more slowly as the words began to form something he had not expected. His posture shifted, his shoulders tightening, his breathing no longer steady. Vanessa did not reach for the phone. She did not need to. She watched Ethan instead, reading his reaction the way she had always read a room. "What is that?" she asked, her tone still controlled, but now carrying a sharper edge beneath it. Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, moving line by line, his expression changing in small, almost imperceptible ways. Confusion, recognition, doubt. "It is," he began, then stopped, his voice catching just slightly before he continued. "It is a review of the accounts." I leaned back slightly, my hands returning to my lap. "A detailed one," I added. Vanessa's gaze sharpened. "And who requested that?" she asked. I met her eyes, steady, unhurried. "I did." Another silence. This one heavier, more defined. Ethan looked up at me now, his expression no longer uncertain, but unsettled. "Why would you do that?" he asked. I held his gaze without hesitation. "Because I prefer to understand what I am signing," I replied. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of her folder, the smallest movement, but enough. "There was no need for that," she said. "Everything has already been explained." I nodded once. "It has," I agreed. "Just not completely." Ethan's eyes moved back to the screen, his focus narrowing now, his attention no longer divided. "What does this mean?" he asked quietly. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I allowed him to continue reading, to reach the conclusions on his own. Understanding is more powerful when it is not given, but realized. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice firmer now. "It means nothing," she said. "It is an external opinion based on incomplete information." I shifted my gaze back to her, my expression unchanged. "Is it?" I asked softly. She held my gaze, her composure still intact, but now actively maintained rather than effortless. "Yes," she said, "and it is unnecessary." I allowed a small pause, then spoke again, my tone even, controlled. "Then you will not mind clarifying a few details." Ethan looked up again, this time directly at Vanessa. That shift was important. Subtle, but important. "What details?" he asked. Vanessa turned to him, her expression softening slightly, her voice adjusting to something more reassuring. "Ethan, this is just a misunderstanding," she said. "These reports can misinterpret normal financial restructuring." He hesitated, just for a moment, then looked back at the phone. The hesitation remained. I watched quietly, not interrupting, not pushing, just allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. "The signatures," he said slowly. "It mentions inconsistencies." Vanessa's response came quickly. Too quickly. "That is a technicality," she said. "Variations happen." I tilted my head slightly, my voice calm. "Of course they do," I said. "But patterns also matter." Ethan's brow tightened, his focus sharpening now, his attention no longer guided, but searching. "And the transfers," he continued. "It says," he stopped again, reading more carefully this time, his expression shifting further. Vanessa's composure held, but the space around her had changed. The control she had maintained so precisely was no longer absolute. It was being tested. "Ethan," she said, her voice quieter now, more controlled. "You are overthinking this." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at me. Not with confidence, not with certainty, but with a question he was only beginning to understand. "Mom," he said slowly, "what are you saying?" I met his gaze, steady, clear, without hesitation. "I am saying," I replied, "that before I sign anything, I want every detail accounted for." Vanessa leaned back slightly, her eyes fixed on mine, her voice now carrying a calm that was no longer natural, but constructed. "And if everything is accounted for?" she asked. I allowed the smallest hint of a smile, not of satisfaction, but of certainty. "Then there will be nothing to worry about," I said. And in that moment, the balance shifted again. Not completely, not yet, but enough to make one thing clear. The outcome was no longer guaranteed. And for the first time since the meeting began, Vanessa no longer looked like someone who had already won. The room did not move, but something inside it had shifted beyond repair. Ethan was still looking at the phone, but he was no longer reading it the same way. At first, he had been scanning, searching for reassurance, for confirmation that everything was as simple as it had been presented. Now he was examining, slower, more carefully, as if each line carried weight he had not been prepared to carry. Vanessa watched him, her expression composed, but her attention sharpened, recalibrating with every second that passed without his immediate agreement. "Ethan," she said softly, her tone controlled, deliberate. "These kinds of reports are designed to raise concerns. That is how they justify their involvement." He did not respond right away. His eyes remained on the screen, his brow slightly furrowed, his focus narrowing in a way I had not seen in a long time. It was familiar, not new, just buried. "It mentions dates," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain. "Specific ones." Vanessa leaned slightly toward him, her posture still relaxed, but her presence more intentional. "And dates can be interpreted in different ways," she replied. "Context matters." I remained still, my hands resting calmly in my lap, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Control does not come from speaking first. It comes from knowing when not to. Ethan lifted his gaze from the phone and looked at her, not fully convinced, not fully questioning, but no longer aligned without thought. "Why would there be inconsistencies?" he asked. Vanessa's answer came smoothly, but with just enough urgency to reveal its structure. "Because systems are not perfect," she said. "Because people are not perfect. Small variations happen all the time." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without challenging it directly. "They do," I said. "Individually." Ethan's attention shifted back to me. "What does that mean?" he asked. I met his gaze, steady and clear. "It means that when variations repeat in a pattern," I replied, "they stop being random." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Not uncomfortable, just undeniable. Vanessa did not speak immediately this time. She watched Ethan instead, measuring his reaction, adjusting her approach in real time. "Ethan," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, more personal. "You know how much work I have put into organizing everything. This was for us. For the future." The word future lingered in the air, carefully placed, meant to anchor him to something larger than the details in front of him. He hesitated. That hesitation was no longer subtle. It was visible, tangible. "I know," he said slowly. He stopped, his eyes dropping back to the phone. "I just did not realize." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Vanessa leaned closer, her tone gentle, reassuring, but now more focused than ever. "You do not need to worry about every detail," she said. "That is why I handled it." I watched her carefully, not the words, but the rhythm behind them. The structure. The way she positioned herself as the solution to the uncertainty she was now trying to contain. It was consistent, effective, but no longer invisible. Ethan nodded slightly, but the movement lacked the certainty it once carried. "Right," he said, but the word did not settle. It hovered, unstable. I reached forward and picked up the phone, not abruptly, just enough to draw their attention back to the center of the table. "There is one section," I said calmly, "that I would like you both to look at more closely." Vanessa's eyes followed the movement, her expression tightening just slightly. "Margaret, this is unnecessary," she said. We have already gone over everything. I did not respond to her directly. Instead, I turned the phone slightly toward Ethan, guiding his focus without forcing it. Here, I said. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he read the highlighted section, his breathing slowing, his posture becoming more still. This transfer, he said quietly. It moved control from, he paused, reading again, from joint authorization to a single authority. Vanessa responded immediately. Temporarily, she said. It is a standard step in restructuring. I looked at her, my expression unchanged. Temporary structures still have consequences, I said. Ethan looked up again, this time directly at her. Why did you not mention that? He asked. The question landed differently than anything he had said before. It was not defensive. It was not guided. It was his. Vanessa held his gaze, her composure still intact, but now actively maintained. Because it is a technical detail, she replied. It does not change the outcome. I allowed a small pause, then spoke again, my voice even controlled. Outcomes are built on details, I said. Ethan's shoulders shifted slightly, his posture no longer aligned with hers, but not yet fully separate. He looked at the document on the table, then at the phone, then back at Vanessa. Is everything here accurate? He asked. The room held still for a fraction of a second. Vanessa's answer came, measured, controlled, but no longer effortless. Yes, she said, but it is being presented in a way that creates doubt. I nodded once, acknowledging the strategy without validating it. Clarity can feel like doubt, I said. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands no longer resting as they had been, now shifting slightly against the table, searching for stability. I think we should take a step back, he said. Vanessa's gaze sharpened. There is no need to step back, she replied. We are already here. He shook his head slightly, not fully rejecting her, but no longer following without question. No, he said quietly. I want to understand this. And in that moment, the structure that had been built so carefully, so patiently, began to fracture. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be reversed. Because once someone decides to understand, control becomes something else entirely. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her eyes fixed on him now, her voice calm, but no longer in control of the room. Then we will go through it, she said. I sat back, my hands returning to my lap, my posture unchanged. The process had begun, not because I forced it, but because they had reached it on their own. And that was always the point. The room did not return to what it had been. Once a question is asked with intention, it changes everything that follows. Ethan was no longer sitting the same way. His back was straighter now, but not from confidence, from awareness. His hands, which had once rested neatly on the table, now shifted slightly, no longer still, no longer certain where they belonged. He looked at the documents again, then at Vanessa, and this time, there was distance in that look. Not rejection, not yet, but distance. Walk me through it, he said, his voice steady, but different. Not guided, not borrowed. His. Vanessa held his gaze, her composure still intact, but the ease was gone. Now, everything she said required intention, calculation. I already have, she replied, her tone soft, controlled. This is simply a restructuring to protect what we have built. Ethan did not nod this time. He did not immediately agree. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his attention narrowing. Then explain the authority shift again, he said. Why move control into a single position? A small pause. Vanessa's fingers rested lightly against the folder, her posture still composed, but her stillness now deliberate rather than natural. It is temporary, she said. It allows for smoother transitions during consolidation. I remained quiet, watching, allowing the conversation to belong to them. Because this moment was never about what I would say. It was about what he would finally see. Ethan glanced at the phone again, then back at her. And who holds that control during this temporary phase? He asked. The word temporary carried a different weight now. Vanessa did not answer immediately, just a fraction of a second. But enough. I do, she said finally. The room settled around that answer. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing it, not reacting, just processing. And you did not think that was something worth explaining clearly? He asked. Vanessa's voice softened, adjusting again. Ethan, I handled it because it was easier. Because it avoided unnecessary complications. He held her gaze, longer this time. For who? He asked. Another pause. Longer now. More visible. Vanessa's control remained, but it was no longer seamless. It had edges. For us, she said. But the word no longer carried the same certainty. Ethan looked down again, his attention returning to the documents, but not with the same passive acceptance. Now he was tracing, connecting. These transfers, he continued slowly, they were not all recent. Vanessa nodded slightly. No, they were structured over time. Without telling me, he said. It was not a question. Vanessa inhaled quietly, her posture remaining composed, but her responses now carefully constructed in real time. You trusted me to manage these things, she replied. I acted within that trust. Ethan did not respond immediately. He sat there, the silence stretching, not empty, but full of something forming. Understanding does not arrive all at once. It builds, piece by piece. And once it begins, it does not stop. Did I? He asked finally. The question was quiet, but it landed with more weight than anything said before. Vanessa's eyes held his, her expression controlled, but no longer effortless. Yes, she said. You did. He nodded slowly, but the movement did not signal agreement. It signaled recognition. I trusted you, he said. Then he paused, but I did not give up my awareness. Another silence. This one heavier than all the others. Vanessa did not speak immediately. For the first time since the meeting began, she had no immediate response. Not because she did not have one, but because none of them fit cleanly anymore. I shifted slightly in my seat, not to interrupt, but to acknowledge the moment. Ethan, I said calmly. He looked at me, his expression no longer uncertain, but searching. Before anything moves forward, I continued. You deserve to understand every part of what you are agreeing to. He nodded once. Not quickly, not automatically, but deliberately. I do, he said. Vanessa exhaled softly, her posture still composed, but her control now clearly challenged. We can go through everything, she said, line by line. Ethan looked back at her, his gaze steady now, no longer shifting. We will, he replied. Then he paused, his voice lowering slightly. But not like this. The words settled into the room, firm, clear, irreversible. Vanessa's expression tightened, just slightly. What do you mean? She asked. He glanced at the documents, then at the phone, then back at me. I mean, I want an independent review, he said. Vanessa's reaction was immediate, though controlled. That is not necessary, she said. It will only complicate things. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, he replied quietly. It will clarify them. The balance shifted again, this time more visibly, not in volume, not in movement, but in direction. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to reveal the calculation behind them. And you trust that more than me? She asked. Ethan held her gaze. Right now, he said, I trust clarity. The silence that followed was final. Not empty, not uncertain, just settled. The structure Vanessa had built was still there, but it no longer held the same authority. It had been questioned, examined, and once something is seen clearly, it cannot return to what it was. I sat back, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged. There was nothing more I needed to do, because the shift had already happened. Not because I forced it, but because the truth had been allowed to stand where it could be seen. And once it is seen, it does not move. No one reached for the pen again. It remained exactly where I had placed it, parallel to the edge of the document, untouched, unnecessary. The room had changed in a way that could not be reversed, not by explanation, not by reassurance, not by anything that had worked before. Ethan was no longer looking at Vanessa for direction. He was looking at the documents, at the phone, at the space between all of it, as if trying to understand how something that had felt so certain could now feel so incomplete. Vanessa sat still, her posture composed, her expression controlled, but the quiet authority she had carried into the room was no longer intact. It had not disappeared, but it had been exposed. And exposure changes everything. We will reschedule, Ethan said finally, his voice steady, but different now. Not hesitant, not guided, decided. Vanessa turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly, her tone calm, but edged with something sharper beneath it. There is no reason to reschedule, she said. We are already here. He shook his head once, slowly, not reacting, not arguing, just setting a boundary. No, he replied. We are not. The words settled into the room with quiet finality. Vanessa held his gaze, her composure still present, but now working harder to maintain itself. "And what exactly do you think changes by waiting?" she asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked down at the document again, then at the phone, then finally at me. For a brief moment, there was something in his expression that had been absent for a long time. Not confidence, not certainty, awareness. "Everything," he said. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her fingers resting against the folder, her posture still controlled, but her position no longer central. "You are overcomplicating this," she said. "This is a straightforward process." I allowed a small pause before speaking, my voice calm, even unhurried. "Straightforward things do not require pressure," I said. Vanessa's gaze shifted to me, her expression tightening just slightly. "There is no pressure," she replied. I met her eyes, steady, unshaken. "Then there is no need to rush." Another silence followed. Not tense, not uncertain, just clear. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling into a position that no longer leaned toward her, but stood on its own. "We will have everything reviewed independently," he said, "and then we will decide." Vanessa did not respond immediately. For the first time since the meeting began, she had no immediate path forward that preserved her control without acknowledging what had already shifted. "Fine," she said finally, her voice calm, but flatter now, less layered. "If that is what you need." Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in closure. "It is." I reached forward and gently slid the document back toward her side of the table, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply returning it to where it belonged. "When everything is clear," I said, "we can revisit this." Vanessa's eyes followed the movement, her expression composed, but her certainty no longer present in the same way. "Of course," she replied. But the word no longer carried control. It carried acknowledgement. Ethan stood up first. Not abruptly, not forcefully, just with quiet intention. He did not look at Vanessa immediately. Instead, he gathered his thoughts in the silence that followed, then turned to me. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple statement, but it carried more than the words themselves. I nodded once, my expression unchanged. "Understanding is always worth the time," I replied. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. Vanessa remained seated for a second longer, then stood as well, her movements still precise, still controlled, but now measured in a different way. Not leading, adjusting. She did not speak as we moved toward the exit. The hallway outside was quiet, the same neutral space it had been before, but it felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because everything inside the room had. Ethan walked slightly ahead, his pace steady, his posture no longer divided between two directions. Vanessa followed, her steps aligned, but no longer setting the rhythm. I walked behind them, not as an observer, not as someone removed, but as someone who had allowed the truth to take its place without needing to force it. When we reached the lobby, Ethan stopped. He turned to Vanessa first, his expression calm, but firm. "We will talk later," he said. She nodded once, her face composed, her voice even. "Of course." But there was no longer certainty in the exchange. Only process. He then turned to me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was no need. The distance between us had not disappeared, but it had shifted. "I will call you," he said. I inclined my head slightly. "When you are ready," I replied. He nodded, then walked toward the exit, the glass doors opening and closing behind him without hesitation. Vanessa remained for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on me, her expression controlled, but no longer guarded by certainty. "This was not necessary," she said quietly. I met her eyes, my voice calm, steady. "It was," I replied. A brief silence passed between us. Then she gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in recognition, before turning and following Ethan out the door. I remained where I was for a moment longer, the quiet of the lobby settling around me. Nothing had been raised. Nothing had been forced. No voices had been lifted. And yet, everything had changed. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and walked toward the exit, my steps steady, unhurried. Outside, the air was clear, the light sharp and steady, illuminating everything without distortion. I paused for just a moment, my hand resting lightly against my stomach, feeling the calm certainty that had been there all along. They had laughed at what they thought I carried. They had built their confidence on what they believed they understood. But they were wrong. It was never about what they saw. It was about what they missed. I lowered my hand and stepped forward, the path ahead no longer uncertain, no longer shared, but entirely my own. Because in the end, they did not lose because I fought back. They lost because I never needed to.